Hello. Thank you for your time today. My name's David Cushman. I run a thing called Faster Future Consulting. I'm the author of a book called The 10 Principles of Open Business. So I've been working in digital strategy and transformation and change for more than 20 years now. I'm currently developing, although when I've looked at my own research, I've been developing this for more than 2 years now, this idea of the responsive organization. And in particular, we're going to talk about responsive people as well, and how you can become more responsive. So first thing I think we have to talk about is the elephant in the room, if you like, the context shock that we're all going through right now. And context shocks for me are things where there's a big change in either the timeframes in which we work, the locations we work, the culture in which we're working, or just a big shift in events. And what we find, if we take a look at systems thinking, what we find throughout any kind of big change is that there's a series of trends that were already happening that are revealed by the context shock. So trends, for example, like working from home, that was already in place. Technologies were already being developed. People already wanted to do it. And so that trend was already among us. It's just that the context shock of COVID-19 has accelerated that particular trend. And I'm sure many people you will hear from today will reference the fact that we're going through something like 10 weeks, or in 10 weeks, 10 years of digital transformation. Very rapid. But what that shock tends to do is that, first of all, there's a kind of crash in performance. There's a worry, concern, fear folding back into ourselves. And then there's this steep learning curve towards a new normal. Now, what concerns me about a new normal is it's often made up of lots of the bits of the old normal rather than a response to the changed context that has happened and our experiences within that new context. So for me, we need to start creating organisations that can benefit from these shocks rather than be knocked backwards by them. So let's just talk through one quite straightforward example. So we recognise a context shock. We know from what happened with COVID-19 that that's now creating significant change for us. So let's recognise that that is a context shock. The next thing to do is actually to try to understand the consequences that emerge from that. So one of the better ways to do that, we could map that. We could just go, well, let's think through an example. Let's say less people are working in offices. Consequences of that is there's less demand for public transport. There's less demand for the services and utilities around offices. There's less demand for shops and restaurants and all of the things that operate around those. And you can look at those as second order consequences. And then you look at the potential knock-on consequences of each of those on how we experience our lives. One of the better ways to do it is with a bit of systems mapping and try to understand the feedback loops within each of those nodes. So that little diagram underneath the word consequences on your screen now is just a brief attempt to map some of the consequences for well-being for people's ways of working as a result of COVID-19. And what we look at when we're looking at a systems approach is to appreciate that there's a certain amount of energy, the stock in the system, and it will flow in certain ways. And we have to work out which direction those flows are going in, whether there are positive feedback loops or negative feedback loops. And if you're familiar at all with any of the kind of systems thinking that emerges just from looking at natural sciences, you'll appreciate that that can create quite a complex network quite quickly. But what we need to understand is what those consequences might be, and then start looking for weak signals that would give us an idea of how to make sense of this. And one of the ways in this particular example is that you could start looking at the number of Google searches for self-help, for example, or for equipment that people need at home. You could start making predictions based on patterns that emerge. There is a great example involving a radiographer. So if you ask 100 radiographers to look at this particular X-ray of a pair of lungs, something like 80% of them, 80 out of the 100, will not recognise an anomaly on it. But 20 people will spot the anomaly. And those 20 people aren't necessarily more expert, they've simply spotted the thing that the 80 people didn't. And everyone can learn from what the 20 people see, the pattern that emerges from that. In the case that I'm thinking of, somebody's actually drawn on a dancing gorilla onto the X-ray. And most people miss that because they're not looking for it. It's too weak a signal in the kind of biased environment in which we look to read what future signals are. But once you can show the other 80 people that there is a dancing gorilla there, then they are much more open to understanding what the new needs might be that are emerging, the new experiences that you have to respond to. And that takes us to how do you then create the new products and services that respond to it. And that is as simple as any other rapid iterative model. So when we are creating to meet need, we're doing so in the kind of rapid iterative managed innovation ways that we've become used to from processes like design thinking or lean startup or agile. In other words, you're taking insight, you understand what the human experience is in this context, you understand therefore what the requirements are that you might need to respond to, and what it is that your success criteria might be, so that you can start building towards that need with each iteration. That's all we're talking about with this kind of minimum viable learning vehicle, is another way to think about it. We're trying just to make only that which we need to learn about what our customer, end user needs in the new context that we've found. So we've had a context shock, there's new consequences. In those consequences, there are new ways of experiencing, and we have to develop products and services that meet the new experience. So in this example here, we're thinking about how do you make the best of office life and home life. Over the last few weeks, we've been learning how to work from home. Some people see a lot of benefits in that. Some people don't. There's big productivity benefits in general, but it's not a productivity benefit for all. So gathering the insight you need in order to fill the gaps in what might need to be virtualized for a digital experience at home to meet what you're missing of the office is one way in which you can start making a response to the new context that's emerged, because you've been able to map what that consequence is, but also what the experience of the people is. So an important part of the experience of the people. So the way I think of this at scale is to look at it over time a little bit. If you're an organization that's just taken each context shock and scrambling back to your old normal, so you got to a new normal that's kind of a diminished version of your old normal. In that example, you might think about, I've managed to replicate some of what I used to do in the office digitally from home. This includes having meetings by Zoom, and it includes having workshops on Zoom. But what we're missing, half of it is missing, in that we're not having those kind of lightweight conversations, the light touch conversations. We're not having our downtime that we might have enjoyed from commuting. We're not having our work-life, not balance, but identities separated so that we can think differently in different contexts. We lose quite a lot. So when we've scrambled back to an old normal, or our guesstimate of what this new normal is, we've lost a lot of the benefits even of the old normal. So I'd see that kind of traditional organisation as scrambling back to a diminished and declining normal. And over time, that gets further and further away from how people actually experience their lives. Whereas a responsive organisation is one that is designed to benefit from shocks at scale. And that's by building response to the customer or staff needs emerging from each of those context shocks. So as I just mentioned, as we talk about understanding what that shock is, we respond to it really rapidly. That's not just what you learn, because this is really what a responsive organisation has at its guts. That's why that insight is so important here. It's not just what you learn, it's how quickly you are able to respond to it. And it's also the choices you make. Because if you make choices towards an intended future and one that which you want to embrace, you are in fact inventing the future. you're making it at the speed and scale in which it's happening. So there's a way in which you can think about it as the future can just happen to you and you just respond to it. And that, I think, is the organization on the lower side of this slide. Or you can think about ways in which you can intend a future and build one that you choose to embrace. And that's more the organization on the top end of this slide. So a key part in all of this, of course, is people. And people are kind of the drivers of the whole thing. So if I look at the diagram on the right here, this kind of spidergram, an important thing is to understand what your people are experiencing. And in the context of work here and the story we've just been telling, we're looking at a world in which some people see the world of distributed work as better in some aspects than the world of office-based work. But as you can see from the map, both have advantages and disadvantages. This is just an example map, but you can imagine that people would be coming up with new thoughts about how they can respond to each of these things and which bits are valuable to them. So if I look at that map on the right, I know there is a difference between what my people like and what my people don't like about office and distributed life. And if they're now going to be thrust back to a new normal, well, first of all, what we did to them was, through no fault of our own, they had a new normal thrust on them. Everybody work from home now. So we went through a very, very difficult period, which has all of the fear and unhappiness and bad organizational response that you'd expect from throwing people at change who aren't prepared for it. So I think an important part of how we prepare for it is to start thinking about making ourselves more responsive to change. And when I think about the amount of change that's likely, even just in the idea of distributed working, we've still got a huge journey to go on. If I look at my little diagram on the left, I think where we were was that little red dot. We had messed around a little bit with working across distributed time and a little bit against distributed space. Nothing at all in the distributed leadership part. If you imagine working more in distributed time, so let's say there's organizations that need to catch up on their productivity after the impact that we've seen over the last 10, 15 weeks, and they might need to start working in shift systems. We might need to see people working 7 days a week. I'm not saying everybody working 7 days a week, but teams working across 7 days in order to start to catch up. And if you've got that, you've also got the immediate realization that the leader, the boss, can't be there in every group all of the time. So this notion of distributed leadership becomes much more important. And if I just refer back to the previous slide, each of these small iterative teams that is working in an agile way, working with teams, pods of maybe 4 or 5 people in to develop small pieces of work to keep moving at speed, they're making their own decisions. The decision making is distributed in there, but that's based on having a really clear North Star, and that's to learn as much as you can really rapidly against the needs of your customer. So if that's clear, people can lead from within those small groups. And you have some other constraints around that based on your organization and its own goals. But what it's demonstrating, I think, that the little circle on the left is that we've got a long way to go in what we can learn about how we can work differently and how work can be distributed across time, space, and leadership. So how can we help people become more responsive themselves? And another way of thinking about this is in terms of making yourself personally anti-fragile. So if the responsive organization is designed to respond positively to shock, and that's really the definition of anti-fragility, is something that benefits from shock rather than is broken by it or even resilient to it. It benefits, it absolutely likes shock because it likes the opportunity to learn from shock and therefore move faster towards need. That's true of us too as human beings. We need to be comfortable with change and we need to be actively seeking learning from change opportunities. But that's easier said than done. You know, as you will probably appreciate, we've been programmed for millennia to fear movement, to fear change, to see a shifting shadow on the African savannah as something to be afraid of. But we can train ourselves to think differently. And I think part of that is to indulge in play, actually. I was thinking about how we got to the anti-fragile mindset, how I got to it, how some of the people I've worked with have got to it, and what our shared experiences have been. And I guess we were lucky enough to have grown up playing games on computers. So for the first time, we got a chance to put inputs into something and test and learn through incremental growth. What happens when we try something? So we've got to experiment at really low cost and at low risk and have fun doing it. So I think if we can give people environments like that, we can start replicating that experience. So it's a lot of gameplay. How, if people aren't playing games, we need to get them to play some games. The other part is to have them able to try that kind of approach, that test and learn approach in the real life. And that's about understanding where the feedback loops are in what you do and what the output is, what the outcomes are, and devising ways in which we can monitor and guide that to act as a positive or negative feedback loop and reward every move that people make towards greater responsiveness. And then there's this other piece, which is about actually mindset. And if you're not familiar with Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset, it's worth investigating a little. It's really about psychological safety, trying to create some psychological safety for people to try new things. And so I think you can take yourself or your group through a number of practices, a number of workshop activities, or even online activities, in which the first thing to do is understand where you sit on the spectrum between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. And those with the growth mindset are those that are actively seeking learning opportunities. They don't think they're born with a particular level of intellect and therefore a particular right to be able to understand things, or a particular right to promotion, or any of those things. You're born with the idea that you have to work hard at it and you have to learn your way to solutions. And this gives you the ability to learn new things and to be comfortable with learning new things and to see benefit from learning new things, not risk and threat. So it's worth getting people involved in those kind of low cost and high impact positive psychology programs. A couple that I'd recommend is the Science of Wellbeing, that is run by Yale University, and it's absolutely free and it's really good. It's one of the highest uptake courses ever online, and that just teaches you about happiness and actually in trying to build happiness into yourself and into your life. And there are a number of other courses that you'll find of a similar bent. And I think if you can find your way to anything in growth mindset versus fixed mindset, that will be extremely helpful. So if we get people to go through those steps and then take them into the opportunity to engage in one of these small and rapid iterative teams to develop, even just initially to a minimum viable product with a small team, they will learn through doing in a way that will reinforce all of the ways and other activities that we might want to apply to making people responsive. And that's really the guts of what I have to say today. So I don't know what we did for time. Oh, I think we did it in about 18 minutes.